Are humans making mice bolder?
Welcome to Answers News, May 20, 2024.
In today's top story, researchers are confusing natural selection and evolution. Hello, I'm Dr. Tim Chaffey, and I'm joined today by Dr. Jennifer Rivera and Patricia Engler, and we're going to be looking at several news items in just a minute, but we are joined by a wonderful studio audience here at the Creation Museum. If you guys want to make yourself known, give them a nice clap. All right. Told you it was a good audience. All right, well, let's jump right into this. Researchers are telling us that humans are driving a new kind of evolution in animals. And what they're talking about is how we have impacted our environment in several different ways, building cities where there used to be forests, or of course the big one for them is going to be the climate change issue that they're saying is caused by man. And as a result, animals are, well, it's having a big impact on certain animals, but is that leading to evolution?
You want to go ahead? I was going to say, well, we both have stuff to say about this, so
right.
Go ahead.
Well, you can see right from the first line of the article that it has a lot of problems. So it's talking about, well, the peppered moth is an example of the theory of evolution by natural selection. But hold on. First of all, theory is a pretty strong word for evolution. It's actually more of just a hypothesis. And also, natural selection removes genetic information that's already been there. It can, I've heard it said, it can explain the survival of the fittest, but not the arrival of the fittest. You need to somehow add new genetic information, and natural selection doesn't do that. So what we're seeing isn't evolution. What is it?
You mentioned peppered moths. You might remember that from your biology textbooks. They're kind of the classic case of evolution in action that we see today, right? But it's moths becoming...
I remember in my textbook when I was in elementary school, they had the pepper moths, and they're like, evolution. I'm thinking, well, it's just a moth.
And
it hasn't turned into anything
turned into
else,
another
right?
moth. And then, yeah, so they're using
So what
that
we
as an
see is
example
genetic variation that God put in place there in the original created kinds. And yes, animals are going to change based on environmental conditions. That can definitely affect that. And throughout this article, that's what they're kind of alluding to is how, you humans, once again, are kind of invading the animal populations. And look at all the bad things, basically, that you're kind of, causing animals and the changes that we see. And they talk about paving and rising temperature rates and just all kinds of definitely underlying themes throughout this whole article.
Yeah, so some of the research that they conducted was, I think, is useful. They talked about these tree swallows in New York, and because of a different temperature or something like that, their breeding season starts at a different time, and then when they're really, really young, they're more liable to face cold snaps, and that's more dangerous for them. And so there's things that it's good observation, but what ultimately is the cause for that? Is it just the ones in New York that are now in trouble, but are the ones that are further south, is it better for them? And so they don't give that, they take very localized populations, they don't tell you what's happening in the rest of the area. And peppered moths, I think, is a good example to lead off with, because every single example they give in this article is this creature stays the same creature. There's no evolution happening at all. There's not a single example where it's actually evolution. But I think my favorite line had to do with the hermit crabs. They did this experiment where they threw 6 tires into the ocean, and they were afraid that this is going to trap hermit crabs in there, and that's what was happening. They found over 1,200 of them over the course of a year, and then they said this: it's unclear whether the crabs will evolve physical or behavioral adaptations that can help them escape this ecological trap. It's not unclear. If they don't have the genetic information already in their genome,
they're never going to evolve fins to be able to swim out of the tire, right? It's just impossible. And we know that because of, especially as we continue to study the DNA code of life and the clear instructions that God put in place there and spoke into existence, it's impossible for animals to gain new information, much less reproduce outside their created kinds.
Right, so because this is observational science, that's why all the examples are just what we expect from God's word, variation within kinds of living things God created. We expect that a good designer would build into creatures a lot of potential for genetic variability, so that as they go around the world, they can adapt to different environments, as well as in our fallen world that introduces a lot of new changes that creatures need flexibility to be able to work with. So we expect seeing variation within kinds of created things as natural selection removes genetic variability from the populations. And one example of that, for instance, it was looking at town mice and country mice. So mice that live out in rural areas versus in the cities. And they found that in the cities, mice are actually bolder. And they said that bold mice beget bold mice. I feel like Aesop came up with that already.
That sounds like a fable.
But this is not evolution.
No, it's mice.
And all throughout this article, and you'll see this a lot in articles like this, where they're using natural selection and evolution as synonymous terms, and they'll actually interchange them in the same sentence so that you honestly believe that changes within animal kinds is evidence of evolution. And evolution requires a gain of information, and natural selection is a loss of information.
Right. Natural selection is observable. We can see it happen time and time and time again, and it is a result of what God has put into his creation. And so it's something that is a scientific principle, but it keeps the species strong in a sense. It does not
It's
create
like a preserving
new species.
factor. It was actually described by a gentleman who was actually publishing on natural selection before Darwin even did. While Darwin was actually on his voyage, the HMS Beagle, he is publishing Blythe on natural selection. Much of his information was actually plagiarized by Darwin On the Origin of Species, but he was actually publishing and saying, yes, natural selection is present. We can actually directly observe that, but it's a preserving factor that God put in place there for animals to then reproduce within those kinds that he created, not the liberalizing factor that Darwin claimed that natural selection was. So completely different definitions.
And Patricia pointed out when we were backstage that, these articles, they always talk about look how bad humans are for the environment. They never talk about the good things that humans do. Just a few weeks ago, I got to go on a raft trip through the Grand Canyon. Well, where you get into the canyon at what's called Marble Canyon, there is the world's largest population of California condors. And in fact, the previous time I was there, we saw 11 of them all sitting on a bridge. Well, that's like 2% of the world's population right there on that bridge. But if it wasn't for what humans were doing to preserve them, they would be gone, or very, very few left. And now I wouldn't say they're thriving yet, but I think there's over 600 of them.
Right. And where we do see observational science like this showing, for instance, some birds' breeding habits changing in ways that can affect them negatively, if it's clear that that is human caused and that, within a biblical worldview that affirms caring for creation, then we can use that evidence for good purposes like that. So this is useful. It does support a biblical worldview, and we don't need to make kind of exaggerated claims calling this evolution.
That's right. All right, well, let's go on to our next one. The world first fossil of a 155 million year old brittle star mid-cloning itself. So this is a pretty unique fossil that was found, and of course the date they assigned to it, 155 million years, we would take issue with. But it's one thing that shows that fossilization does not take a long period of time. It's not something where the creature is just lying there dead for a long time and then slowly gets covered up. No, this is something that happened rapidly, and they even make that point in there. What fascinates me the most is the fact that the specimen was frozen in time at exactly the right moment. That is during the relatively short time interval between splitting and full regrowth of the missing body half. So these brittle stars have a unique way of regenerating, of duplicating, and
I always like to say, as a forensic scientist, when something dies, I can tell you it does not lay there intact for someone to find it at a much later time, right? Things move in within 10 minutes of something dying and immediately begin to break that organism down. So to get this level of detail, you have to have instant, rapid burial and pressurization going on here to preserve that level of detail. So definitely a testament to an event that we often talk about in the Bible, and that is the global flood of Noah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also worth pointing out that they could tell that this is a brittle star because it looks exactly like brittle stars do today and was doing what brittle stars do. So
it must be because there are no humans causing it to rapidly change into something else.
That explains everything.
I mean, they said there's actually 50 species of brittle star. There are 50 different species today doing this exact same thing, and they look just like this one that's 55 million years. No, 155 million.
155.
Yes.
Yeah, so that 155 million year, that is an assumption. It's stated as a fact, but it really isn't. Those long ages are based on basically assumptions about things going on in the rocks around the fossils. You have to actually start with old age beliefs to make those assumptions, to use them in the first place. But from a biblical view, we see the fossil record not as a record of things slowly happening over millions of years, but of basically a burial record. What order were things buried in during the global flood? So you find marine fossils like these brittle stars, other different marine fossils, even on mountaintops all over the world. That's actually great confirmation of the flood.
I think my favorite part of this article, though, is they actually say from the beginning, right, suggesting these features evolved together. They recognize that little pieces of this couldn't evolve at different stages over time, that the entire brittle star creature and the fact that it has this ability to clone all evolved together at the same time. Well,
That was a lucky mutation,
that
right?
just made lucky, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And this find, it doesn't actually tell evolutionists how they think it happened. It just pushes it back to 155 million years ago within their framework. So lots of questions that they still have to answer.
Well, that they have to.
That they have to, yes.
We know God created this creature with the ability to do that, and it's pretty cool. It's just one of the ways that creatures are able to reproduce. And yeah, it would be strange if you could lose a leg and suddenly it becomes your clone. That would be pretty odd.
It'd be such a weird family dynamic. Is this my parent or child or sibling? I don't know.
Uh-oh, there's going to be a lot of novels written about that kind of stuff pretty soon. All right, well, let's move on to this next one from the Daily Caller. You got California school district settles a $360,000 lawsuit with a teacher that they had fired for refusing to use students' preferred pronouns. Now, this is not something that actually went all the way through the court system, and one side was determined to be, wrong or not, but they did settle out of court. But I think this was a good reminder that teachers do have rights in the classroom, and a lot of times the school boards and the unions will try to act as if they do not have the rights to stand up to, tyranny, really. But they still do, and this is in California that this teachers don't have rights. So you would think if any place in the country they didn't, well, California, they still do.
I'm just thankful that there's teachers out there that are bold enough, right, to pursue this type of legislation. And she says in the article that the school district told her she had to lie to their parents about the children's gender identity. It wasn't like she was just not using their pronouns. There was multiple steps in here the school told her she could not do. They said she had to use the preferred pronouns. She had to refrain from expressing her religious beliefs in the classroom and with her students on social media, and that she had to allow students to use bathroom or locker rooms that match their preferred sex. So we can see here why she, pursued like she did, and we're just thankful that she was able to settle, but I don't think it stops there.
Right, yeah. And the school's denying any sort of wrongdoing against her and saying it's not a win for her, but the foundation that stood up for her is definitely seeing this as a victory. One line of this that stood out to me was how it was talking about if the public school district's actions were legal, no teacher of faith would be qualified to serve as a public school teacher. So that's what this foundation that was supporting her said. And that's true. If you did make this a law, then teachers wouldn't be able to stand on uncompromised biblical convictions within the classroom. But actually, it's worth pointing out that a number of Western countries are certainly moving in that direction. So that's something to keep an eye out for. I've talked to Christians either in communist countries now or who have lived in communist countries in the past, and that is one of the things they say is that Christians are treated as second-class citizens who can't hold government jobs. So that is a real thing to be watching for. There are a number of things that we can do, though. For instance, know your legal rights, like this teacher did, and like even Paul in Acts 22 did. Roman soldiers were going to beat him up, and he said, "Hold on, is it lawful for you to beat a Roman citizen who's uncondemned?" He held them accountable to their law. Defending families, discipling young people, living above reproach, and also being equipped to give an answer for your biblical beliefs in gentleness and respect, which 1 Peter 3:15 talks about. That's actually in the context of persecution and suffering for righteousness. So there are a number of things we can be doing to overcome evil with good in this setting.
Yeah, very good. All right, next. This one from the UK, a pediatrician there who led the review of child transitions says U.S. medical groups are misleading the public. So this is somebody who was ready to retire, and they asked her to head up this commission, and she did, and she realized that they have been making some big mistakes, and so over in the UK, not too long ago, they actually stopped groups from giving these puberty blockers and everything else to children. And yet, meanwhile, in the U.S., we have groups that are just flat out lying about the data and misrepresenting the data and saying no, that don't question the science. We've heard that a lot of times, and yet here's somebody who headed up this commission and said no, actually the evidence is the opposite. It's much better if they are not getting these things.
And I think one of her big claims was that she just kept saying, There's no guarantee, and even in her findings that she published, she said they have no scientific basis or anything to support the idea that these kids aren't going to change their mind when they become mature enough and responsible enough as adults to then realize, wow, I've made this big mistake, and I'm not any mentally, psychologically more healthy or happy with my life. It's kind of a simple way of saying it. But that was one of her big claims, is that they're at that age when they're trying to instill these puberty-blocking drugs on these kids. They're not even mature enough to even make these kinds of decisions and shouldn't be afforded the opportunity to, just select to have what we call irreversible damage done to their bodies.
Yeah, so there's a studies show that more than 80% of children suffering from gender dysphoria outgrow it on their own by late adolescence. And yet if you were to give all of them puberty blockers, well, 4 out of 5 would have moved on from it. And yet in our culture in the last 5 to 10 years, it's been such a trend, such a fad for them to be able to do it. In fact, it's one of the only things that children can diagnose themselves for. They can go into clinics and tell, a young girl can go in there and say that she needs some testosterone, and they don't even really do any further checking. They'll claim that they do, but there's so many reports from young women saying, no, they never asked questions. I was able to get it easily, and they regret that. So it's tragic. Abigail Schreier has a book called Irreversible Damage. It's not written from a Christian perspective, but she does highlight a lot of these cases and many of the problems that it has created. And it's heartbreaking when it gets to this issue. And in here, so she led the what's called the CAST review, so a 366-page review. But she said about these American organizations, it wouldn't be too much of a problem if they were saying this is a clinical consensus and we're not sure, so we're still questioning that. But what some organizations are doing is doubling down on saying the evidence is good, and I think that's where you're misleading the public. You need to be honest about the strength of the evidence and say what you're going to do to improve it. But instead they ignore it, they hide it, they just, I guess, gaslight.
Right. Yeah, and that line did stand out to me. She said, while a considerable amount of research has been published in this field, so studies about these effects, systematic evidence reviews demonstrated that the poor quality of the published studies, meaning that there's not a reliable evidence base on which to make these clinical decisions. So the studies that are out there supporting this aren't actually good research, is what she's saying. And that stood out to me for a couple of reasons. One, she's talking about the importance of informed consent, basically, which is a staple of medical ethics, and especially secular medical ethics, because when human individuals are the authority for truth, their freedom to make their own decision is all you really have to go on. But you can't do that if you don't have good science to base your decisions on. So actually, this is a big problem within a secular ethics perspective. And also it brought up just something to keep in mind about the nature of scientific publishing. Just because it comes from scientists doesn't mean it's good science, and there can be a lot of biases within the publishing industry as well. Also, like faulty assumptions, faulty starting questions, faulty data sampling and analysis techniques. There's a lot of experimental problems that can happen. So we need to be holding scientists up to accountability standards that are very rigorous. And it reminded me of a report by the Royal Society of Open Science back in 2019 that pointed out the problems with the publishing system, that it encourages scientists to distort and exaggerate their results, to encourages publishers to cherry pick data. So I think you found as well another recent study.
That could never happen in journals. Could it, Dr. Rivera?
I was going to say a news article just came out this week where Wiley Publications, who is kind of like a publisher for multiple academic journals, actually is closing, and 19 of their academic journals due to exactly what we're talking about here, and that is faulty publications, faulty science going into this, and so corrupt that it's basically not salvageable. So they're just going to completely just close the peer-reviewed journal.
Yeah. And I think there's an important reminder for all of us, whether you're Christian, non-Christian, that we all have a bias. And there's times where we just want to win an argument or want to prove our point, or maybe we have really good motives, or we want to show people that Christianity is true. But make sure you're using good arguments. Make sure you're using the truth to support that, rather than, we've got some articles on our website called Arguments Creationists Should Not Use. Some of them are not necessarily wrong. They're just, we're not sure yet, that we need more data to come in. Other ones are just flat out wrong, and we should avoid those. And so I think we need to watch ourselves as well, that if we're on the side of truth, so let's use truth to support it.
Absolutely.
All right, and next, trans people are officially classified as mentally ill in Peru, sparking fury among LGBT groups. Now, this is not something that would have been too surprising just 40 years ago in many places. In fact, in the United States, homosexuality for a long time was listed in the DSM as a mental disorder, and then it was removed in the 1980s. And so it's not something that's surprising if this would have been going on a while ago, but for somebody to do it today, that seems rather hateful and bigoted, isn't it?
Well, actually, it's the Bible that gives you the standard for calling things like hatred wrong in the first place. Right. So this article did point out some examples of physical violence against people who identify with these communities, and the Bible would affirm that that is wrong. You can't commit violence against a fellow image bearer. The Bible gives us a foundation for valuing people made in God's image, and the government, the article quotes the government saying in Peru that it categorically reaffirms respect for the dignity of the person and their free actions within the framework of human rights, and the Bible gives you the basis for that framework. So if you try to criminalize Christians, you actually lose the foundation for what you're advocating for.
Mm-hmm. And I think it was very difficult for the people that were, victims of these harsh actions that are described in this article. Very difficult for them to get any type of justice, and they really haven't received justice yet. They did get an apology from the government that this occurred by certain police officers, and they were kind of attacking certain LGBT community individuals. And that's the shame of it, I think, is, we do, if something like this does happen, we hope there's a justice system in place to protect those individuals, because that's definitely not the actions that we should take. But instead of mental illness, I think it's better to say they definitely have a spiritual illness, right? Because they have rejected the created order, and they've rejected their creator God, and they think by, choosing this alternate lifestyle, right, that's what's better for themselves, they have totally dismissed the God who does love them and has sacrificed for them. So I think that's something we definitely need to pray for these individuals as well.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great point, and also building off what you were talking about at the beginning. Jesus tells us that we are to love one another. He tells us to love our neighbor. He tells us to love our enemy. Do you think they fit into one or more of those categories? I think that they do. And so that does not mean that we advocate violence against people that we disagree with or that we think are in sin. And so, yeah, we do hope that there's justice if people are being mistreated. But at the same time, we do have to recognize that there truly is a spiritual battle, and the only solution to the sin-cursed and wrecked world is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so that's the ultimate hope that we can offer people, and that's what we need to be sharing. All right, so unprecedented, that's in quotes, unprecedented CO2 rising 10 times faster than any time in recorded history.
Which is a little exaggerated. Right?
Yes, there are some exaggerations going on here. There are a lot of assumptions going on here. And if this headline is not meant to scare you, well, then I don't know what is. There's some alarmism going on in this article.
We've only been recording CO2 levels since the 1950s. So to say that it's unprecedented in the history of the Earth is a little bit of a stretch, don't you think?
Well, but because they're making assumptions about the ice cores that they're drilling, even up to 2 miles in depth, and they're saying, well, this is hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years worth of ice cores, and so we can track how much CO2 there is because there's some trapped in the ice, and we can measure that, and we know that the rate's going up since 1950 or whatever. It's 10 times faster than any other period in time. The problem is those ice cores are not hundreds of thousands or millions of years of ice layers. What they say is each of these, what they call annual rings in there, or annual layers, I should say. They'll say each of these is, you see this dark and light thing, that's 1 year. No, it's actually a period of thawing and refreezing. If anybody's lived in the north like I have, I grew up in Green Bay, like Patricia in Canada, in winter when there's snow on the ground, you can get a thaw and then a refreeze, and a thaw and a refreeze. And it doesn't mean that this is something that is taking an entire year to form. These things can happen daily, or they can be the result of storms and everything else. So they have the wrong clock when they're measuring all of these ice cores. And these ice cores that we're looking at are less than 4,500 years because they're since the time of the flood.
Right, an example of starting with the wrong assumptions and then getting the wrong conclusions and then finding a journal that your message is kind of popular with. So just an example of that.
And CO2 is just terrible for plants, right, Dr.
I was
Rivera?
going to say there's a lot of benefits to having CO2. We do believe, especially back when the dinosaurs, roamed the earth, that the CO2 levels would have been higher because we would have had very lush plant life. Because what we do know is that CO2 is critical for maintaining plant life on Earth. We know that farmers actually pump CO2 into their greenhouses to help grow their crops, and more CO2 actually means more food for humans and animals. So we should not be alarmed by this, right? It's just part of God's cycle, right? As we say, that it's in our atmosphere. I mean, in fact, CO2 is only 0.04% of the gases that exist in our atmosphere.
Right,
So,
isn't the main greenhouse gas water?
yes.
Right.
Actually, water vapor is much more abundant, so.
And is there a direct correlation between CO2 and rising temperatures, or is sometimes the other way around?
Yeah, I actually consulted Jessica DeFord, who is one of the authors of our new climate change book for kids. I encourage you to pick it up today. It just came out, co-authored by her and Ken Ham, our founder and CEO. And Jessica said that the relationship is actually not correct. She says what happens is she says, data indicates temperature rises first, followed by CO2, and as temperature drops, CO2 increases. She goes, not the other way around. So as temperatures drop and gets cooler, what we see is that CO2 actually rises. So it's not warming temperatures that causes that to happen.
All right. Well, let's move on to our last one then. And this is, here we go. Papua New Guineans, genetically isolated for 50,000 years, carry Denisovan genes that help their immune system, studies suggest. So this, some people say Denisovan or Denisovan. This is a branch. The way they would talk about it in evolutionary history, they would say this is a group of humans that has died out, but there was some interbreeding in the past, similar to what they've said about Neanderthals. And we would just say, yeah, they're fully human. And so what they did is they studied people who live in New Guinea, and they studied some who live at sea level, essentially, and then some who live up in mountainous areas. And they're talking about how they detected, up to 5% of their genetics from the Denisovans. And they said it helps their immune system, even though there was a statement in there where over 40% of the deaths in that area are from infectious diseases. So I didn't know, it doesn't seem like it's helping all that much, or maybe it would have been higher, I don't know. It just, that was a little odd. They didn't really explain that, but.
But it's evolution, right?
Yeah.
That's what they're saying.
It was funny because they were talking about how they evolved this mutation to combat hypoxia because of the elevation these highland individuals live in. I found, and they really went on quite a bit about it, and I found that kind of interesting just because we know that there is a whole, what we call physiological system in place that God put there in humans. So if you go to an elevation that's extremely high, I think it's like over 14,000 feet or something, immediately your body, your kidneys are going to sense that you're in a lower oxygen environment, and they trigger a hormone that is going to then reproduce more red blood cells to help, what we say, contradict that deficiency. So it's not an evolved mutation, right? That we see in humans.
Feature.
It's a really cool thing that God created and that any of us can experience. And I think you actually said that you kind of, you were hiked in very high elevations, right, in Australia, didn't you?
Yeah,
do that there?
well, so what they do, not in Australia, but what they'll do is, if you've ever climbed mountains or anything, they'll actually go up much higher than they need to then because they're letting their body adjust, and then they have to come back down, which I think is such a bummer. You gain, you climb up to like 12,000 feet, and then you go another 500 feet, and then you have to come back down to the 12,000 for the day. So your body can adjust, and then you keep going up higher the next day, and you got to do the same thing. And how disappointing, when it's hard to go against gravity, and then you got to do it all again. But yeah, the body God has designed us in ways to cope with that. And you have people who live, like in Peru, with very high evolution, very high, no evolution, a lot of elevation, and oh man. But their bodies can handle it because they are accustomed to it. It's not evolution.
No, so this is just another example of variation within a kind of species God created, the humankind, confirming good design. And it's also worth, I think you mentioned how people call the Denisovans, and even the article saying they're extinct human relatives and human cousins. So really using these evolutionary assumptions to dehumanize this ancient people group. We know they were just people because clearly they could produce offspring with other people. So these are members of the humankind. And it's an example of, you might even say, evolutionary racism, so dehumanizing this people group based on evolutionary assumptions. And the fact that they're not alive anymore doesn't make this dehumanization any better. But again, God's word gives us the foundation for recognizing that all humans are descended from one man, Adam, and his wife Eve. God would have put a lot of genetic variability into their genes, allowing them to spread out, become different people groups, but we are all one race, the human race.
All right, and speaking of evolutionary assumptions, we have a book there that deals with a lot of those. And that one is called Glass House. So we covered a couple of articles today, especially the first one talking about that variation within a kind is not evolution, and natural selection is not evolution. So Glass House goes through.
And I think what's great about that book, it's written on a level that everyone can understand. It's not like super technical. So if you have friends or family struggling with evolutionary ideas, definitely a book that we would recommend.
And if you've got somebody, a loved one who's struggling with that whole gender identity issue or any of those related issues, we've got another book by Martin Iles. He is our executive CEO, called Who Am I? And that is dealing with that particular issue. If you understand who you are, that you are a human being made in God's image, and you got that first and foremost, those other things will fall into place.
And there's, two excellent chapters in there I highly recommend, and that is What is a Man and What is a Woman. I really appreciate those. They're just so well done.
And since we're at the Creation Museum, might as well mention this real quickly. About a year from now or so, maybe not even that long, we'll have a whole exhibit dealing with that issue, tentatively titled Radiance. We'll see if it stays that, but all right. So we have a couple of things to tell you about as we wrap up. In fact, I'm going to let Dr. Rivera tell you more about the curriculum because she knows more about it than I do.
Our 12 Stones curriculum is designed for Christian schools, and it's just a fantastic way to teach those apologetic truths in your children as early as kindergarten. They are going to be designing a preschool book as well. It is right now K through 2nd. They're working on the upper elementary right now, but I just highly encourage you if you're looking for a solid curriculum, because there just wasn't one out there, and so we decided to write one, and it's probably the best Bible curriculum I have ever seen. So if you definitely have kids in a Christian school, or I would say even if you're homeschooling, you could still use this Bible curriculum.
And if you want to
Yeah,
share about
Answers for Educators. We're
Educators?
excited about this event. This event will take place here in Legacy Hall on Sunday night, and then we will actually be on site at Answers Academy all day, Monday, July 22nd. Patricia and I are both going to be teaching and speaking at that event to educators. So if you have a friend or family member who is a Christian school educator or even a public school educator, that's why we have this in the summer. So if there are what we call those missionary teachers out in the public school system, but they want to come here and get equipped apologetically and just be fed with some biblical truth, they are welcome to attend. We only have, I think, less than 50 spots left. So if they're interested, I encourage you to register soon. And it includes a very nice dinner here as well Sunday
And
night.
they can get their CEUs as well, right?
And they can get CEUs for teacher certification.
All right, well, that is all the time we have today. I want to say thank you to our audience. You guys have been great, and also to those watching online. That's all we have for today. We'll see you next time. God bless.
Thank you.